It's my great pleasure to interview Professor Oakes this evening. I read The Scorpion Sting with the idea that I would find all kinds of flaws with it because we often disagree about the Civil War. And I have to say, I couldn't find very many things that I disagreed with, but there are a few, and we're going to talk about those this evening. The thing I think I disliked about the book was it's now requiring me to rethink everything I ever thought I knew about the Civil War. To start, Professor Oakes, if you could give us an overview of The Scorpion Sting, and please relate it to your book of last year, Freedom National.
It's a continuation of a project that began with the previous book, which is the one Louise mentioned on Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. That book prompted me to think anew about the process by which slavery was destroyed during the Civil War, and ended up producing the book you mentioned, Freedom National, last year. And this book is part of the continuing rethinking of that process of slavery's destruction. The more I continue to think about it, the more I have to revise my own previous thinking. So Freedom National revised certain things that were in the Lincoln-Douglas book, and this book already revises some things that were in the Freedom National book. What they're all trying to do, what they all seem to be doing, is complicating the usual simple narratives of how slavery was destroyed. There are several of them out there. The most familiar one is, I suppose, Lincoln freed all the slaves with the stroke of his pen by signing the Emancipation Proclamation. The more elaborate version of that would say that Lincoln understood from the time he was a young man that it was his destiny to free the slaves, but knew that he had to wait until the American people came up to his advanced thinking about it. Another one that's become surprisingly popular recently is that slavery was abolished during the Civil War inadvertently, that it was the accidental byproduct of war, that nobody ever intended it to happen. And, it's outlandish, but it's there. And the most popular one among historians, and the one that most influenced me when I was a younger historian, is what I now call the Skinner box theory of emancipation. It's defined. Emancipation can be understood as through the principles of behavioral psychology as a simple stimulus response argument, that slaves run to Union lines when that's the stimulus. When enough of them run to Union lines, the stimulus becomes overwhelming, and Lincoln is forced to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. What I've been saying, especially in the last book and this book, is that those tend to be ahistorical. They don't appreciate the impact, for example, especially of the anti-slavery movement in formulating an anti-slavery agenda that was politically viable and constitutionally reasonable to Americans who believed, almost all of Americans who believed, that the Constitution did not allow the federal government to go into the South and abolish slavery in a state where it already existed. That being the case, how can you have a national anti-slavery politics? Beginning in the 1830s, abolitionists begin to think about this problem and formulate a series of policies that they believe will surround the South with what they call a cordon of freedom. They will suppress slavery on the high seas. They will refuse enforcement of the fugitive slave clause in the North. They will return all enforcement to the states themselves, so that the northern states will be free states, truly free states. They'll abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. They will ban slavery from the territories. They won't allow any new slave states to come into the Union. They will not support slaveholders whose slaves rebel on the high seas, and the like. And in all these ways, they believe they could surround the slave states with what they called a cordon of freedom, until, in the popular metaphor of the day, slavery, like a scorpion surrounded by fire, would ultimately sting itself to death. That is, They would restart the process of state-by-state abolition that ended in 1804 when New Jersey abolished slavery. At the time, folks thought that that process would continue. It had been abolished state by state by state during in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution, and after New Jersey did it in 1804, people naturally assumed the next state will be Delaware and Maryland and the like, but it didn't. And by the time you get to 1860, it's been 55, 60 years since any state abolished slavery. And the point of the scorpion sting was to restart that process. The agenda was to restart that process. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say you can't understand what goes on during the Civil War unless you understand the project that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans came into the war intending to do. What he meant when he said that he wanted to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction.
Now, what we do know is that in the first months of the war, Lincoln is attempting to convince the border states to emancipate through state action.
Right.
And even in the midst of war, that doesn't, I know you say that, 5 states do that, but Kentucky, for instance, does not.
Right.
Delaware does not.
That's right.
Even though you have very few enslaved people in Delaware.
That's right.
And so how likely, and I know this is counterfactual, but I'm still going to ask it anyway, how likely would it have been that slavery would have been extinguished that way, given that there are these states who absolutely are not willing to go in that direction?
Right. No, I don't know. Nobody knows, because it's, if things had been different, things would have been different. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that I don't think any interpretation of slavery's demise works without the war. The war changes everything. The war makes things possible, right? I don't think the Emancipation Proclamation is conceivable without a war, because it's a war measure. I don't think slavery would have died on its own without a war. I don't believe that interpretation. I don't think the scorpion sting would have worked without a war. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, wars don't automatically lead to slavery's abolition. They never did in the past, and there's no reason to think that it would have during the Civil War, had it not been for the fact that Republicans began implementing these 2 very different policies right from the start of the war. The one that we're familiar with, military emancipation, slaves run to Union lines and the Union will emancipate them. That's what armies have always done during wars. It's happened in the American Revolution, happened in the War of 1812, happened during the Seminole War. And the Union started doing that very early during the Civil War. By the summer of 1861, it's emancipating slaves coming into Union lines.
But it's not universal emancipation.
It's not universal.
It's emancipation here and there.
That's right. Emancipation, military emancipation, as it is initially implemented, is more like the military emancipation from the Revolution, from the War of 1812. They're following the precedents. But you need to know that that's what they're doing. You can't just assume, again, that the history of emancipation starts in 1861. It doesn't start in 1861. If you don't know the history, if you don't know how military emancipation has worked in the past, in the American past, and Americans were familiar with it. Joshua Giddings, the great anti-slavery congressman from Ohio, published a book on the Seminole War in 1857, detailing the process by which Union American forces in Florida emancipated slaves in the late 1830s during the Seminole War, and explained why military emancipation works that way. They know what military emancipation is going into the war. So they have certain expectations that slaves will run to Union lines. They respond initially in ways that are familiar to the history of military emancipation in previous American wars. They use the language and the justifications for military emancipation that you hear military officers using during the Seminole War. The laws of war allow this, they overrule state laws and such. And it's helpful to know that, because if you don't know the precedents and you don't know what happened prior, if you don't know the history, you won't even recognize what's going on. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do here, is reconstruct the prehistory, the assumptions about emancipation going into the war. And that, as I say, therefore you can see then why in the spring of 1862, when the Second Confiscation Act radically shifts military emancipation to a much more aggressive plane, where they're going to adopt universal military emancipation, then you can see they've gone somewhere else. They're using military emancipation in a way that's different from the way it had been used in the Revolution, in the War of 1812. Right?
But there's criticism of Lincoln at that time that he is not really enforcing the Second Confiscation Act.
Oh, but he is enforcing the Second Confiscation Act. It seems to me, incontrovertible. The letters go from Lincoln to Benjamin Butler in New Orleans as soon as Congress passes the Second Confiscation Act, saying, you know, get going, consider them free, things like that.
And why is the Emancipation Proclamation necessary then, if there is a Second Confiscation Act on the
Because the Second Confiscation Act, in and of itself, applies only to slaves who are already in occupied Union lines. It also assumes that authorizes the president to issue a proclamation that will expand military emancipation to cover all areas in rebellion, and that's what he does.
Okay, let's turn to the whole issue of the Republicans and the scorpion sting, that plan itself.
Okay.
That plan requires gradual emancipation, or at least the Republicans are accepting gradual emancipation.
Right.
How much is that plan a product of Republicans in general, or just a small group of Republicans? Because we know that there are abolitionists who certainly would never approve of a gradual plan.
Oh, I would back off from that statement. I think there's a tendency in the literature to confuse immediatism, which is an argument that the process of emancipation must begin immediately, with a call for immediate uncompensated emancipation. If you start from the assumption that even someone like William Lloyd Garrison, who is among the first to call for immediate uncompensated emancipation, Garrison knows that the Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to do it. So he's either an idiot, which he isn't.
Well, he doesn't want to abide by the Constitution at all, because he sees he sees it as a pro-slavery document.
He sees it as a pro-slavery document, and therefore he has two different ways of getting around it. In the middle of the 1830s, his newspaper proposes a series of constitutional amendments to surround the South with a cordon of freedom. A constitutional amendment to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., to repeal the Fugitive Slave Clause, to ban slavery from the Western Territories. The difference between Garrison and most abolitionists is most abolitionists believe that can be done by mere congressional statute, that the Constitution does allow those things. But it's the same project. It just thinks it has to be done by constitutional amendment. It's odd to think that he's proposing a series of constitutional amendments to do this, but not a 13th Amendment as we know it. No amendment to absolutely abolish slavery everywhere. The way they're thinking is the states will do this on their own. Once they're surrounded, it will dawn on them. They've lost the kind of artificial support that the federal government gives them by constantly allowing them to expand, and by protecting slavery and protecting runaway slaves and that sort of thing. The assumption all along is that the thing that's going to have to happen is to get the federal government to position itself so that the states will resume the process of abolishing slavery on their own. So I don't think even abolitionists assumed that if that's right, if William Lloyd Garrison is saying this is the way it's going to be done, then notwithstanding his rhetorical commitment to immediate uncompensated emancipation, he clearly understands that in practice it's not going to happen that way. In practice it's going to happen a different way.
You know Frederick Douglass very well, so would he also be within that camp?
No, Frederick Douglass occupies, in a way, the other constitutional extreme of the abolitionist movement. There are two extremes, constitutional extremes. One is the Garrisonian extreme that says the Constitution is a hopelessly pro-slavery document and it doesn't allow the federal government to do anything at all. At the other extreme, there's this very small but ingenious group of people who make the argument that the Constitution is in fact an anti-slavery document, that it does in fact empower the federal government to do what most people in the United States, including most abolitionists, don't believe it has the power to do. So if you start from the assumption that it's an anti-slavery document, which is where Frederick Douglass ended up, then anything short of that is a failure on the part of the government. So he's very critical of the Republicans and the Lincoln administration during the war because he believes that the Constitution, in fact, does allow them to do more than they are doing. But very few people, in fact, I'd be surprised if you could find any historian today who believes that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document. The dispute, the dispute is really how pro-slavery was
Right,
it.
exactly.
It does tell you how in the middle of the 19th century the political position you take always depends on a constitutional interpretation. Right? It's what they call, political theorists or political historians call it constitutionalism. It's the language of politics in the middle of the 19th century.
Now, given this plan of strangulation,
Right.
and are we to assume that the southern states were correct in their assessment,
Well,
that they were in danger, and
Yeah.
they were
Right.
at least, they had an argument for secession?
If, again, one of the consequences of assuming that the history of emancipation starts in 1861 is that it makes secession inexplicable. It makes it a hysterical overreaction to a non-existent threat. But if, in fact, the Republicans are committed to this policy of surrounding the South with a cordon of freedom, and I think the evidence is quite clear that that's how Republicans were talking, and that's how secessionists were talking. They're talking back and forth to one another in Congress saying, the secessionists are saying we have to leave because if we don't leave, they're going to surround us like a scorpion, girt by fire until it kills itself. They say they don't intend to come here, and that's not the issue. They're not going to come here. They're going to surround us. So everyone understood the terms of the debate, right? And they leave because they wouldn't submit to the cordon of freedom. Right? That's what secession was all about. They believed, like most Americans in the middle of the 19th century, that their future depended on expansion, right? And in some ways, we talk about the Civil War as a war over what kind of union the United States was going to be, and it was. Was it going to be a union with slavery or without slavery? But it was also a war over what kind of empire the United States was going to be. Was it going to be an empire based on free labor or an empire based on slave labor? And they're all assuming they're all operating from more or less imperial assumptions in the sense that they all assume that they need to and can expand. And if you're going to stop us from expanding and you're going to open up the floodgates to fugitive slaves by refusing to return them, and you're going to drop an anti-slavery citadel in between Maryland and Virginia by abolishing slavery in West Virginia, sucking up fugitive slaves as you go, and refuse to return them, you're threatening us. We're going to have to pull back from the border states, and then the border states will lose interest in slavery, and they'll go. And despite it is certainly true that Kentucky and Delaware hold out in ways that nobody expected. But on the other hand, by the end of the Civil War, 5 states abolished slavery. Right? Maryland abolished slavery, Louisiana, Tennessee, Missouri, and Arkansas abolished slavery. Right? Now, if one of the problems with the usual interpretations that focus so exclusively on military emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation and ignore this other policy, the one that caused the war to begin with, is that they have no use for the 13th Amendment. They have no explanation for why a 13th Amendment is necessary. If you believe, as I do, and I think increasingly historians are coming to realize that emancipation wasn't enough, which is what Lincoln was saying all along, then what does it take to get a 13th Amendment? What does it take to get any constitutional amendment ratified? 500,000 slaves are emancipated by the Civil War, by the time the war ends. But the number of slaves freed isn't necessarily very helpful in getting a constitutional amendment passed. What you need is states. You need three-fourths of the states to ratify. Right? Now, in 1860, there are 18 free states and 15 slave states. You're not even close to having an amendment ratified that's going to abolish slavery. But over the course of the war, West Virginia secedes from Virginia and is admitted only after it is required to abolish slavery as a condition. 2 more free states are admitted to the Union. And after intense pressure by Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation, beginning especially in July of 1863, using the Emancipation Proclamation as what he calls a lever to force the states do begin to abolish slavery. And by January of 1865, when Congress finally gets that amendment out to the states for ratification, the balance of power between free and slave states has shifted dramatically. And there are now 26 free states and 10 slave states, right? One more state abolishes slavery and you're 27-9, and that's your 3/4, right? In that sense, it's the cordon of freedom policy. It's the policy designed to get the states to abolish slavery that is absolutely critical to completing the process of slavery's destruction.
Now, the plan, the cordon of freedom plan, is based on damage done to these states economically, right? You hem them in.
Yes.
They can't expand.
Right.
They can't grow economically.
Right.
Are we doing a disservice to this whole idea by forgetting that slavery is more than an economic institution? Delaware certainly is not benefiting that much from slavery.
Well, I said in my last book that I think the Republicans were naive about the economic weakness of slavery, that it was actually much stronger than it was. But I think the Republicans, I don't think the kind of people who make arguments about the weakness of slavery or a slave power conspiracy, of which these arguments are usually held up as somehow morally less robust than an argument that says slavery is brutal and inhumane. But the truth is that the people who make one of those arguments are most likely to make the other arguments as well, right? So slavery is wrong because it's economically backward, because it generates a slave power aristocracy, and because it's brutal and inhumane to slaves. So they're not mutually exclusive arguments. They're part of a series of arguments that people have developed in opposition to slavery. And
but what we see is that even if people are not benefiting economically from slavery, there is an incentive to keep people enslaved. It's a moral, it's a social institution as well.
Yes, that's right.
And
that's
so
correct.
That's not changing. And so why wouldn't they still hold on to it? Might not be the pillar of the economy,
right?
But it would still.
Oh,
be
I agree.
An institution.
I agree. I don't think without a war, I can't imagine slavery having been abolished. I think this for me is the great tragedy of the Civil War. That not that it was pointless, but that it was necessary. Right? I can't think of any other way it could have been done. There is an argument out there that slavery would have died anyway, and people still say that. They say it on The Daily Show. But I don't see it. I don't see it.
And so if this is a Republican plan, and the South decides to secede because they realize they're in big trouble since the Republican Party is in power.
Right.
Did it really matter who was elected president as long as that person was a Republican? So is it about the Republican Party, or is it still about Lincoln?
It's about both. I think I think it's about both. Lincoln is a Republican. Lincoln is nothing if not a party guy.
He's a moderate Republican.
He's a moderate Republican,
but
more
conservative Republicans.
There are more conservative Republicans and there are more radical Republicans. But one of the things that struck me, and I pointed this out in my last book, is that the Republicans divide on a lot of different issues that we're familiar with the Civil War that aren't related to slavery. They divide on the Homestead Bill. They divide on the taxation issue, on the financial issues. They divide on the Pacific Railroad Act. And those things get passed through coalitions of Northern Democrats and Republicans. On emancipation issues, on every issue every time emancipation comes up or slavery comes up, the votes are virtually unanimous. Republicans are looking for the ground on which all Republicans can stand. And it's a remarkable series of unanimous votes from the first summer of the war all the way to the end. On Washington, D.C. emancipation, on slavery in the territories, on the Slave Trade Treaty, on the Fugitive Slave Law, on the first Confiscation Act, the second Confiscation Act, the revision of the military orders, and the like. Every time it comes up, they're unanimous and united. And it's impossible for me to imagine in those circumstances that Lincoln is going to step outside of that. No matter how moderate or radical or conservative he is, there's a discipline in that party on the issue of slavery because that's their issue. And Lincoln is committed to the party. And he'll say, if it had been me, I would have preferred that the Washington, D.C. Emancipation Bill maybe would have been a bit more gradual. But this is the way it's being done, and I'm going to sign this bill. He's not going to veto the bill, And you see it the other way, too. Radicals will say, had it been up to me, there would have been no compensation in this bill, but this is what the party wants, and this is what we're all going to vote for. They're going to maintain their unity on that, and they do. So Lincoln is important because he's a very effective war leader, and he's a very effective at holding enough Democrats in the war coalition. And he does certain things that I don't think we fully appreciate. For example, it's Lincoln, starting in July of 1863, who begins to pressure those states to get slavery abolished. Right? And he starts writing a series of letters to the governors of Kentucky and Tennessee and Louisiana saying, get this done, get this done, get this done. He doesn't know how to force them because he still doesn't think that Congress can say you must abolish slavery. So by the end of it...
Not even to a seceded state?
He doesn't even believe that you can do that to a seceded state. So what he ends up with by late 1863 is, in his frustration, is, I figured it out, right? Every state that comes back into the Union must endorse all the laws and proclamations that have been passed in the years since they left the Union. And that would include the Confiscation Act and that policy exists for about 3 weeks. And it exists for about 3 weeks because almost immediately after he makes that announcement at the beginning of the congressional session in his December address, Republican congressmen introduce a 13th Amendment, right? And the first state to abolish slavery right after that, the first state, is Arkansas in early 1864, and it bypasses the Lincoln proposal and instead adopts the language of the proposed 13th Amendment. And that's what those states begin to do. But it's the 13th Amendment on the table that provides the model for the states to begin abolishing slavery. So it works both ways.
And why is he not more involved with getting, or not involved at all, it seems, with getting that measure passed through the Senate? Is it because he does not have to say anything, or what?
Through the Senate?
Really does, yeah, because he really doesn't get involved with passage of the 13th Amendment, that law, until
December.
The second time it's in the House.
I don't think I don't know the answer to that because he doesn't really say anything about it until presidents don't have any constitutional role in the amendment process.
But he gets involved.
But he does get involved, but that's what's unusual. It's not unusual that he did not get involved the first time around. He didn't need to in the Senate, it's the House. And nobody knew until the end of that several month-long debate that the Democrats were going to have enough to stop it. All they needed was a third of the votes in one of the two houses, and that's what ended up happening to stop it in June of 1864. So, and it's after the Republican Party commits itself to that, the party man. The Republican Party commits itself to that in June in its convention where he's renominated, and then he starts saying, I support the 13th Amendment.
If we could talk for just a moment about the whole concept of property in man and how different that was from the perspective of Republicans who are pushing this cordon of freedom and Southerners. One of the things I'd like you to speak to is there consensus in the South? Because I think sometimes we believe that everyone in the South is on board with what's happening from the slaveholders' perspective. Is that the case? Do they have so much power that people are not questioning what they're doing?
Well, actually, that's a tough question. There's a lot of division within the South over secession, but it doesn't mean being opposed to secession doesn't mean you're anti-slavery, and it doesn't mean you don't accept the argument. One of the points I tried to make in my last book, and more pointedly in this book, is that if you want to understand if the Civil War is caused by the conflict over slavery, you need to know what slavery is. You need to know what slavery is because you need to know what a debate over slavery is going to look like. And it's very crucial that you understand that Americans in the 19th century understood slavery to be property rights in human beings. So that that's what differentiated slavery from other forms of inequality, like the patriarchal subordination of women to husbands and fathers, like indentured servitude, like wage labor, like racial discrimination. There are different forms of inequality. And property in man had a very particular resonance in the middle of the 19th century, and the debate between anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners is framed in those terms. Right? If there is a constitutional right of property in human beings, then the federal government cannot constitutionally abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. It cannot prevent me from going into the North and recapturing my property. It cannot prevent me from moving into the territories with my property. If you're an anti-slavery Republican, you're going to say, but the Constitution does not refer to slaves as property. It refers to them as persons held in service. And it does so deliberately because the founders did not want the concept of property in man included in the Constitution. And the language coming out of the convention debates from 1787 on that score is unambiguous. Madison says we do not want the concept of property in man put into this language, into the Constitution. We will refer to them as persons held in service, right? So this becomes absolutely the fundamental foundational principle for all anti-slavery constitutionalism, which is to say anti-slavery politics. It's easier to emancipate a slave because slaves are not constitutionally protected property than it is to confiscate a house.
They're not constitutionally protected property, but there are certain rights that the slaveholder has. Otherwise, then how could the slaveholder go to the North and recapture?
Well, this is the debate. Republicans aren't united on this, but the general position of anti-slavery people is that the Fugitive Slave Clause doesn't have an enforcement provision in it, and it's up to the state. Slavery is strictly a state institution. Right? Freedom is national, slavery is local. Right? The Fugitive Slave Clause should not be interpreted to empower the federal government to protect the local property rights created by state and local laws in the South in the northern states that don't recognize the right of property in human beings. So the argument against the Fugitive Slave Act is that it empowers the federal government to do something that is none of the federal government's business. It's strictly a state institution. The federal government can't abolish slavery in the states. On the other hand, it can't expect the federal government to be protecting your property once that property steps beyond the territorial limits of the state that creates it, because it has no constitutional standing as property. That debate it's remarkable how clear-headed everyone is about that debate, that it's about property rights in human beings, and Republicans are saying, all anti-slavery people say there is no such thing as a constitutional right of property in human beings. You see it. Lincoln says it repeatedly throughout the 1850s. If, in his arguments with Stephen Douglas, if the only way you can say that, in that case, for example, the only way you can justify Stephen Douglas's principle of popular sovereignty, that the people of a state, of a territory, have the right to have slaves if they want, is if you assume that you can make property out of a human being. It's the property principle, and I reject the property principle. I don't think you can make. Only a state can do that, and it has to be a state. But the territory can't, because the territory is the creature of the federal government, and the Constitution rules, and the Constitution does not recognize property rights in human beings.
Okay, but if you are a state in secession, technically you've committed treason. Is that not the case?
If you're a Northerner, yeah. If you're a Southerner, you're just fighting for your independence.
Legally, okay, whether you're in the North or the South.
Right.
Or have you committed treason, or there's some other little vague phrase that we can assign?
I'm perfectly happy to say yes, if that's what you want me to say.
Oh, good.
But
because I have a follow-up.
Okay. I actually dislike that language. I understand that at the time people... Well, because I think it's provocative, and I want to understand what happened. I fully understand that as far as Northerners were concerned, as Lincoln and the Republicans are concerned, they're acting on the assumption that this is an act of treason. And the law of treason therefore applies, and they're trying to apply it to the emancipation and confiscation issues. And that's very important. I'm not interested in saying that...
But there's certain... But we do have laws.
Yeah.
And given that particular action,
right.
Is that not treasonous?
Well, was it treason for the American colonists to declare their independence from Great Britain?
Certainly from the British perspective.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. From the British perspective, the colonists are traitors.
Since we are a nation, okay, and this
well,
whole
I think
idea
of treason as a kind of individual act, and this is something else. They're declaring their independence.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind if you want to call it.
I'll let you slide on that one. But if the North thinks that this is treasonous,
right.
Okay, why can't they go after these enslaved laborers?
They don't need the law of treason. And they do go after them, and B, they don't need the law of treason. The law of treason will actually inhibit them, because under the law of treason, the principle of that the heirs cannot be tainted, tainder. You can't hold the property of a convicted traitor beyond the lifetime of the traitor, and it must go back to the heirs, right? That's why they can, and when I said before, it's easier to free a slave than to confiscate a house, because a house is, everyone recognizes land and homes as immovable property that once it's taken needs to be returned. You can use it, you can actually even burn it down if you need to burn it down. But if you use it and it's not burned down, it goes back to the owner unless they're convicted of treason. And even if they're convicted of treason, eventually the heirs get it, right? That's what taint is, right? You can't taint the descendants. The fact that they're claiming that slaves, it doesn't apply to slaves because slaves aren't constitutionally protected form of property, means that that is irrelevant, that the attainder doesn't apply. It may apply in the border states. It may apply in states that have not committed treason, and and you have to find a different way of getting at slavery in those states. It's a much more complicated problem, which is one of the things I want to say in these two books, is that one of the complications is that there's more than one policy besides emancipation, military emancipation. One is the scorpion sting. Another is that you can't look at what's going on in the border states as evidence of how Lincoln or the Republicans think about emancipation, because they understand that the border states are a legally different place. They haven't seceded, and the laws of war don't necessarily apply, and it's not clear. And so you often, I mean, it's commonplace, right? You look at Lincoln's telling Fremont in Missouri to rewrite his order to conform to the First Confiscation Act. Does that tell you that Lincoln is opposed to emancipation? Well, not necessarily, because it's a border state and nobody knows what you can do in a border state. He has already issued the order to emancipate slaves in the seceded states.
But they're doing some interesting things in the border states after the Proclamation.
Oh, yeah.
They're allowing these enslaved men, who are still enslaved, actually, in the border states.
Yes.
They're allowing them to enlist in the Union
That's
Army. And it's very much against what these local people want.
Oh, yes.
But they're doing it anyway.
That's right.
And they're getting away with it.
That's right. They're pushing and pushing.
How is that possible? I mean, they're really treading on the rights of these folk.
They are. It's very controversial. This is one of the things, people don't understand this about the Emancipation Proclamation, right? The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to the border states. Well, that's not quite true. The emancipation provisions of the proclamation didn't technically apply to the border states. In practice, you can see slaves being freed all the time in the border states by the Union Army, but technically it didn't apply. However, the proclamation also opened the Union Army to the enlistment of black soldiers, and that did not exempt the border states. And very quickly, the Union Army is setting up dozens of recruitment camps in Maryland and Kentucky, and it's causing all sorts of havoc, and they're doing it over and against the intense opposition of the slaveholders and the politicians and the Union Army Union soldiers from those states. You get a virtual civil war within the Civil War in places like Kentucky, where Kentucky Union soldiers are fighting with Union soldiers from Missouri, or not from Michigan or Illinois and stuff like that, because the Union is explicitly trying to destroy and undermine slavery by actively recruiting black men into the Union Army and promising them emancipation in return for their enlistment.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to ask one last question before we open it up to the audience.
Sure.
Could you please define citizenship?
Oh, boy.
Period.
No, I can't. All I can tell you is that it's crucial. It's a crucial part of the debate, and part of the debate is what it means to be a citizen. In a sense, it's not an issue until slavery becomes an issue, because the prospect of emancipation raises the prospect of citizenship, and that raises, for many Americans, white as well as black, the question of what does it mean to be a citizen. That's why, the 13th Amendment is passed, finally ratified in December of 1865. 1866, you get the first Civil Rights Act defining blacks as citizens and declaring that they were entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship. Emancipation,
which has to be supplemented by the 14th Amendment.
It follows it follows the Attorney General's order from late 1862 declaring that the Dred Scott decision was invalid and blacks are in fact citizens if they're born. But that may not hold, so they pass a law. But that may not hold, so they turn it into an amendment. And then, as we all know, the southern states end up narrowing that down, and the Supreme Court narrows that down, and things like that. So the emancipation provokes a century of struggle over what it means to be a citizen. So it's not possible for me to define a citizen, what citizenship means. All I can say is that the struggle over what it means is provoked by the prospect of emancipation and emancipation itself.
Good enough. If you have a question now, would you please go to the mic? There's a mic on each side. Could you make your question brief? Please, no statements. And if Professor Oakes would make his answer even briefer.
I'll try.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jim Pasinich. I'm a docent here. My question you said there were a number of people that believe that slavery would eventually eradicate itself and may take 100 years. And wasn't Abraham Lincoln one of those people that believed that, as a believer in technology as he was, that he thought technology would eventually make slavery too expensive as it was practiced before the war, and that technology would replace the slave, and it may take 100 years, but it would die out?
No, I don't think he thought that. He doesn't talk much in terms of political economy that way about slavery. Towards the end of the 1850s, he gives a few speeches on the superiority of free over slave labor, but as his law partner Herndon once pointed out, Lincoln's conception of the superiority of free labor tended to be moral rather than economic. If anything, he seems to believe that slavery is so economically powerful that it has to be stopped by legislative means. But he's not like William Seward, who goes to the other extreme and makes the most complete argument that slavery is doomed. Once you surround the South with a cordon of freedom, it will die of its own accord because it's not economically feasible. Lincoln didn't talk that way very much. There are some indications here and there that he believed that. He once says early on that slavery should be allowed to die a natural death. The 100-year statement is that's a passing offhand remark he makes, saying in the late 1850s, saying, I suppose if slavery were to die in the most peaceful, most gradual way imaginable, it might take 100 years. But the next sentence is, but God works his own way in his own ways in his own good time, and who knows. And by the time he says that, he's already indicated that he doesn't believe it's going to happen that way. The only time he actually comes out and proposes a timetable is in the November 61 Delaware proposal. There he gives the states the option of it lasting as gradual as emancipation, taking as little as 5 years, as much as 35 years, but I prefer it if it's all over in 10. That's the closest he ever comes to saying how.
But 35 years is a long time for an enslaved
For the last
person.
slave, but yeah, for the last one. It would be young people who were born the day after the law passed, right? So there'd be, the bulk of them in that program are freed immediately and like that, but it's the option. He prefers 10, but he can't dictate what the terms are. It's up to the state.
True, but okay, then if we look at the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, he's
Right.
talking there not about gradual emancipation, but he is talking about a new system. He's talking about something that's occurring over a period of time. He refers to it as
Right.
the ability of the slaveholder and the enslaved person to work their way into a new relationship.
Right.
He's talking about apprenticeship.
Yes.
And he's even after the proclamation
Well
has
after.
been
Well,
issued.
no, yes.
He's talking about some
Yes,
new
I think
system.
I agree. I think it's a mistake to think that he abandons the idea of gradual emancipation with that state-by-state abolition is not the same thing as military emancipation. Military emancipation is immediate and uncompensated always, and he's for that. State-by-state abolition, the best way, however you want to do it. A few months after that, when Arkansas does it immediately, he writes some notes to people saying, look, you misunderstand me about gradual abolition. I thought that's what would work best for you folks, but if you want to do it immediately, go ahead. Gradual abolition for him is like compensation. If that's what it takes to get you to abolish slavery, do it that way. But do it, because
But my point is even beyond abolition, when they are free, technically, he's still suggesting that there needs to be some kind
Well, he's
or at least
suggesting
he won't object to it. I mean, that's
At
the
least he's trying to get Louisiana to abolish slavery. He doesn't believe he has the constitutional power to tell them you must abolish slavery. He suggests one way you might do it is to free them immediately but have an apprenticeship system, right? Well, that's what most white kids went through, right? That you're apprenticed until you're 22 or something. He stayed, you're required by law to stay an apprentice.
But there's a big difference between
Well, no,
apprenticeship.
the difference if you make it legal, then you're requiring the master to educate the slave, the apprentice, in a way that reverses the assumption.
Yes, but we know that
absolutely.
that's not what happens, because actually, when the war is over, African American children are apprenticed, and parents are having a heck of a time trying to get their children back, to get authority over their children.
I agree. It's part of
it's a problem.
Part of his attempt to get the states to abolish slavery, because he knows military emancipation isn't going to do it, is an offer, if this is the way you want to do it. In fact, they don't do it that way. And he abandons the proposal within a few months because the states start adopting immediate. He's very frustrated by December because he hasn't gotten a single state to do it. Right? And Louisiana is particularly frustrating to him because there's a lot of resistance to adopting the Emancipation Proclamation, and he proposes that as one. Maybe you could do it this way, things like that. But we have to take him at his word when he says a few months later, look, my commitment to gradualism was, I just wanted you guys to abolish slavery.
Okay.
And do it, if you want to do it immediately, then do it immediately.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
My name is Jim Mackin. I'm a volunteer here at the New York Historical Society. And the southern states were standing up for their institution of slavery, and they were standing for their own states' rights. But then they come together for this higher order that they call the Confederacy. Did they undergo some change in their own understanding of states' rights, and does that factor into all of the emancipation and the change that happens in the Civil War?
Oh, that's a big and complicated question. It's a famous paradox in the history of the Confederacy that this nation founded on the principle of states' rights becomes more highly centralized than anything the 19th century had seen up to that point, at least in the Americas. So it's well known that that's true. On the other hand, it's important to understand that everybody in the 19th century believes in states' rights, and it's a fight over, how much. The Southerners presumably believe in states' rights, but they believe that the federal government should be the enforcement agent of the Fugitive Slave Clause, and that the federal government should go into northern states and drag free blacks through the streets if we think they're slaves and things like that. That the federal government should pass a federal slave code protecting slavery in the territories. So states' rights, states' rights for what? States' rights, we want states' rights when it's to our benefit, and we want the federal government to do what we want when it's to our benefit.
We still do.
It doesn't tell you, nobody goes to war over states' rights in the abstract. The question is which right, and in this particular case, it was the state right to make people property, and keep them that way, Thank
you.
My name is Pamela Coker. I am no historian, but I recently read a diary of a young woman named Josie Underwood who lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Her father was a retired congressman. They were slave holders, but his belief during the Civil War is he did not believe in succession at all, because he felt the United States of America should be this great country that we were developing, and he did not want us to go to a South American type mini countries that would be warring, or a European type situation, that we had the chance to be really grand. How many people had that belief? Was that a big group, a little group? In the end, the rebels burned their property, and they got very ill-treated for this belief, but it was, I found very
It's very hard to put numbers on this, but there's a saying, latitude determines attitude, right? The further north you go in the southern states, the more likely you are to hear that kind of stuff. The closer they are to a border, the more likely they are to think, if there's a war, the Union Army and the Confederate Army are going to meet in our state, and it's going to be most disruptive. We have the most ties, the strongest ties to the northern state. So you're more likely to hear a slaveholder in a border area talking that way than you are in a deep South state, with the possible exception of there are sugar planters down in Louisiana who talk, that we're better off in the Union than out, and things like that. But generally speaking, that kind of attitude. What you see in those border areas is a much more serious division within the slaveholding class about this. Large numbers of slaveholders from Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland actually defect to the Confederacy in Missouri because they do believe in secession, and others are Unionists. But so it's not that uncommon in the area that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Castle. I'm manager of public programs here at the New York Historical Society. Thank you all very much for joining us for this wonderful conversation. And also, thank you so much to James Oakes and to Edna Green Medford for a terrific night. Books are for sale in our museum store. It's out on our 77th Street side of the building. And they will be signing books, and the book signing is going to be by our Central Park West side of the building. So please join us for that. And again, thank you so much.